The morning Letitia Covington arrived in Redemption Creek, Texas. The dust was so thick it swallowed the stagecoach whole, and every man on the main street stopped what he was doing just to watch her step down into it. It was the spring of 1878, and Redemption Creek was a town that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. There were 2 saloons, a bank that had been robbed 3 times in the past 4 years, a general store run by a widow named Mrs. Peel who knew everyone's business before they knew it themselves, a small church whose white paint was already peeling in the relentless Texas heat, and roughly 400 souls scattered across the surrounding ranch country who depended on the town's weekly market day to remind themselves they were not entirely alone in the world. The railroad had been promised, the way it was always being promised to frontier towns, but the tracks were still a county away, and everyone in Redemption Creek had quietly stopped believing it would come in their lifetime. Letitia stepped down from the stage and paid no attention to the staring. She was 26 years old, with dark hair pinned neatly beneath a wide-brimmed traveling hat that had seen better days, and brown eyes that took in everything around her with the kind of steady, measuring calm that made people instinctively feel they had been found wanting. She was not the most classically beautiful woman who had ever come through Redemption Creek, but she carried herself in a way that made beauty feel like a secondary consideration. She was practical and composed, and she had traveled 700 miles on 3 different stage lines to get here, and she was not remotely interested in being admired by men who had nothing better to do on a Tuesday morning than stand in the dust and gape. She had come to Redemption Creek because her brother, Daniel Covington, had sent for her after their mother passed in the winter. Daniel was 31, a struggling rancher with a small spread called the Box Elder, and he needed help. His wife, Clara, had died 2 years prior in childbirth, along with the baby, and Daniel had been running the Box Elder alone ever since with only one hired hand, and a determination that was slowly being ground down by debt and isolation. His letter to Letitia had been short and honest in the way that only letters from older brothers could be. He needed someone he trusted, someone who could keep accounts and manage the household, and help him figure out whether the Box Elder had any future at all. Letitia had no other family left. She had been teaching school in Austin, but the school had closed when the man who funded it lost his money in a bad investment, and so the timing of Daniel's letter, while sad in its occasion, had felt like something close to Providence. She gathered the 2 trunks that contained her entire life, and she came west. The stagecoach driver handed down her trunks with a grunt of effort, and she thanked him, then turned to survey the street for someone who looked like Daniel. He was supposed to meet her. She scanned the line of storefronts, the hitching posts crowded with horses, the elevated boardwalk where 2 old men sat on a bench watching her with undisguised curiosity. "Miss Covington." The voice came from her left. She turned and found a man leaning against the side of the stage depot, arms crossed over his chest, hat tilted back on his head at an angle that suggested he had been standing there for some time and was comfortable with it. He was not Daniel. He was taller than Daniel by several inches, broader through the shoulders, with a face that bore the particular weathering of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. His jaw was shadowed with a few days of beard, not neglect but simply time, and his eyes were a striking pale gray that caught the morning light in a way that momentarily arrested her attention before she recovered herself. "You are not my brother," she said. "No, ma'am," the man agreed. He uncrossed his arms and came forward, holding out a hand. "Wallace Bishop. I work the ranch adjacent to the Box Elder. Your brother got held up this morning with a fence line that came down overnight, and he asked me to collect you. He said to apologize and to tell you there is hot food waiting." She considered him for a moment. He met her gaze steadily, and without any of the performative boldness she had noticed in some men, the kind that was really just insecurity dressed up in swagger. His manner was straightforward. She shook his hand. "Letitia Covington," she said. "Can you manage the trunks, or should I get someone from the depot?" "I can manage them," he said, and he picked up both trunks with a composure that suggested he was telling the truth. The drive out to the box elder took the better part of an hour along a rutted road that wound through country that was, Letitia had to admit, genuinely spectacular. The land rolled out in every direction in great brown and golden waves, broken by the occasional dark line of mesquite or the silver flash of a creek cutting through the grass. The sky above was enormous and very blue and populated by clouds that moved slowly, like thoughts you could not quite catch. A hawk circled in the distance. The air smelled of dry earth and something faintly floral she could not identify. Wallace drove with an easy competence that she noticed because good horsemen always caught her attention. He handled the team with minimal effort and without the kind of showing off that would have irritated her. He did not try to fill the silence with talk, which she appreciated. After about 10 minutes, when she had looked her fill at the landscape and arranged herself more comfortably on the wagon seat, she spoke. "How long have you had the ranch next to my brother's?" "Going on 4 years," Wallace said. "My father had land up in Kansas. When he passed, I sold it and came south. The Bishop Ranch is about 400 acres, mostly cattle, some horses. And you have hands, 2 permanent ones, more in the busy seasons." He glanced at her briefly. "Your brother is a good man. He has had a hard few years." "I know," she said quietly. "He is very glad you are coming." She looked out at the land. "I am glad to be here," she said, and found that she meant it more than she had expected to. When they pulled into the box elder's yard, Daniel was already coming down from the porch, and the sight of him made something loosen in Letitia's chest that she had not realized was tight. He was thinner than she remembered, and there were new lines around his eyes, but when he smiled it was the same smile from their childhood, the one that had always made her feel safe. "Letty," he said, using her old childhood name, and he caught her hands in both of his when she climbed down from the wagon. "Daniel," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. They stood like that for a moment, 2 people who had come through a season of grief and were measuring each other's survival. Then Daniel pulled her into a hug that was brief and rough and entirely genuine. "I am very glad you are here," he said. "I gathered," she said, pulling back and pressing her palm briefly against his cheek in the way she had done since they were children. "Now let me see this house." The box elder's main house was built from rough timber and adobe, practical rather than comfortable, but it was solid and it had good proportions, and Letitia could see immediately what could be done with it. The kitchen was functional. The front room had a fireplace. There were 2 bedrooms, and a covered porch ran the length of the front and looked out over the yard toward a view of the south pasture that in the late afternoon light was genuinely beautiful. The accounts were a different matter. After supper, when Daniel spread them across the kitchen table, Letitia spent 2 hours going through them with the focused patience she had once given to students who struggled with arithmetic, and by the end of it she had a clear picture that was not quite as dire as it might have been but was not comfortable either. The box elder needed a good cattle season and some careful management. It was possible. She had seen worse turned around. Wallace had stayed for supper, which apparently was not unusual. She gathered from the conversation between the 2 men that they had fallen into a pattern of mutual reliance that was common on the frontier, sharing information about markets and weather and water sources, lending equipment, occasionally helping each other with tasks that required more than one pair of hands. It was a practical friendship with a quiet warmth underneath it that she found unexpectedly appealing to observe. He left after supper with a nod to her, and a brief word to Daniel about meeting the following week to look at the north fence line together. He did not linger, and he did not make any of the comments she had been half bracing for about a woman managing accounts or making herself at home or any of the other casual diminishments she had encountered in the past. He simply said good evening and got on his horse and rode into the dusk. She watched him go from the porch. "Good man," Daniel said from beside her. "So you said," she replied, and went inside to begin unpacking her trunks. The weeks that followed were busy in the way that frontier life was always busy, which is to say relentlessly and without apology. Letitia took over the household accounts completely and began working through the suppliers and the credit arrangements with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had grown up watching her mother keep a family solvent on very little. She renegotiated 2 of the supply arrangements in town with a directness that left the merchants somewhat startled and considerably more respectful. She planted a kitchen garden in the strip of ground behind the house that got the best morning sun. She repaired 2 saddles, cured a batch of jerky, and taught Daniel's hired hand, a young man named Eustace who was barely 19 and very earnest, how to keep a proper inventory of the feed stores. She also, entirely without intending to, spent a great deal of time in the company of Wallace Bishop. It began practically. He and Daniel had their arrangement of mutual assistance, and since Letitia was now running the Boxelder's household operations, she naturally intersected with whatever was happening at the ranch. When he came to help mend the north fence, she brought out water and stayed to help hold the wire because it was faster with 3 people, and she was not in the habit of standing around watching others work. When he came to consult with Daniel about the upcoming cattle drive to Abilene, she sat at the table because the drive involved the Boxelder's finances, and she needed to understand the numbers. When he stopped in on a Sunday afternoon, which he began doing with a frequency that was noticeable but always accompanied by some legitimate purpose, she found herself not minding. She noticed things about him in the slow, accumulative way that is more honest than the sudden, overwhelming kind. She noticed that he listened more than he talked, and that when he did talk, he was careful to say things he actually meant. She noticed that he was patient with animals in a way that revealed something essential about a person's character. She noticed that he had read books and thought about things and had opinions that he offered without insisting on them. She noticed that when something was funny, he smiled with his whole face in a way that transformed it, and that afterward the usual quiet settled back over him like a coat he was comfortable in. She also noticed that he noticed her. Not in the obvious, performative way of men who wanted something. In the way of someone paying genuine attention, the way you pay attention to something you value. She was not looking for this. She had been engaged once, back in Austin, to a man named Robert Hale who had been educated and charming, and had over the course of 2 years revealed himself to be the kind of person who needed a woman to be smaller than him in order to feel adequately large. She had ended the engagement on a Tuesday afternoon with a directness that had scandalized some of her acquaintances and relieved her enormously. Since then she had been, quite deliberately, focused on other things. But Wallace Bishop was making it difficult to maintain that focus, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge it. He was 30 years old, she learned from Daniel. He had grown up in Kansas, the son of a homesteader who had broken sod and built a life with his hands. His mother had died when he was 12, and he had helped his father run the farm through his teenage years before the elder Bishop passed and left Wallace the land. He had sold it, as he had mentioned, and come to Texas because he wanted to build something of his own rather than tend someone else's. He had been alone on the Bishop Ranch for 4 years. As far as Daniel knew, there had been no serious romantic entanglements. There was a woman in town, a schoolteacher named Miss Pratt, who had apparently made her interest known a year or so prior, but Wallace had been politely uninterested in a way that had eventually been accepted with reasonable grace. Letitia learned this not by asking but by listening, because people in frontier towns talked about each other constantly and thoroughly, and Mrs. Peel at the general store was a particular font of community intelligence that was difficult to avoid once she had decided you were worth informing. She processed all of this information and then firmly set it aside and focused on the accounts. The market day in early June changed things. Redemption Creek's weekly market had grown in recent months because a group of Tejano families who had been ranching south of town for 2 generations had begun bringing their goods, and the variety and quality of the produce had improved dramatically. There was also a Mexican woman named Senora Flores who made the best tamales Letitia had ever tasted, and she had been looking forward to market day all week for reasons that were primarily culinary. She had driven the wagon in alone because Daniel was down with a chest cold that she had confined him to bed to recover from. She was at the tamale stand when she became aware of a commotion on the far side of the market. A man named Carl Dunmore, who owned a medium-sized spread to the northwest and had a reputation for being difficult, was in the middle of an argument with a young Tejano man who appeared to be no more than 20 years old. Dunmore was red-faced and loud. The young man was holding his ground with a dignity that made him seem much older than his years, but there was a crowd gathering, and it was the kind of crowd that could go wrong quickly. Letitia had set down her tamales and was already moving toward the commotion when she saw Wallace step out of the harness shop across the way and read the situation in approximately 3 seconds. He was there before she was, and she watched him put himself between Dunmore and the young man with a manner that was quiet and steady and somehow entirely without aggression, which she understood was a considerable skill. "Carl," Wallace said, "what is the trouble?" "This boy is cheating people," Dunmore said, loud enough for the crowd. "Selling short weights." The young man's jaw was tight. "My weights are honest," he said. "I will show any man who wants to look." "Let us look," Wallace said simply. And that was that. The weights were checked by 3 different men and found to be perfectly accurate. Dunmore blustered and eventually moved on. The crowd dispersed. The young man, whose name was Miguel Flores and who was Senora Flores's eldest son, thanked Wallace with a handshake that carried in it the weight of something considerably more than ordinary gratitude. The crowd had been a close thing. The year was 1878, and the injustices directed at Tejano families on the frontier were ongoing and frequently brutal: the theft of land, the casual violence, the legal systems that did not protect them with any consistency. What had happened today was a small thing, but small things added up, and the fact that Wallace had stepped in without hesitation and without any calculation about what it might cost him socially with men like Dunmore said something she filed away carefully. She was back at her tamales when he found her. "That was well done," she said. He looked faintly uncomfortable with the acknowledgement. "Miguel's weights are always honest. Anyone who has dealt with him knows that." "Some people do not deal with him because of who he is," she said. "Then they are fools," he said, simply and without any performance of nobility, just a statement of fact. She looked at him for a moment. "Would you like a tamale?" He looked surprised, and then the full smile came, the one that changed his face. "Yes," he said, "I would." They ate tamales standing at the edge of the market with the June sun overhead and the sounds of Redemption Creek going about its business around them, and they talked. Really talked, not the practical exchange of information that their previous conversations had mostly been. He told her about Kansas, about the flatness of it, about how he had first come over a rise in the Texas hill country and felt something in his chest expand like a window being opened. She told him about Austin, about the school, about the students she had taught, a girl named Pearl who had been 14 and had done mathematics with a ferocious joy that Letitia still thought about, wondering what had become of her. He told her about a book he had read over the winter, a collection of essays that a man had written about land and what our relationship to it said about us. She had not read it, but she had read the author's earlier work, and they argued about it pleasantly and with real engagement for a quarter of an hour. She drove home aware of a warmth in her chest that was entirely unconnected to the June heat. Daniel, confined to his bed with a cup of honey-laced tea and an expression of poorly concealed smugness, when she mentioned that she had run into Wallace at the market, said nothing but smiled into his cup in a way that she chose to address by changing the subject firmly. The summer deepened, and the heat became serious, and the cattle season began to take shape. Daniel's chest cold resolved after a week, and he threw himself back into the work of the box elder with a renewed energy that Letitia suspected had something to do with having his sister there. He ate regular meals again. He laughed more. She had not realized how much she had missed him until she was with him every day and could watch him slowly becoming himself again. Wallace came to supper twice a week now, which had shifted from the practical arrangement it had started as to something more like a habit that everyone tacitly acknowledged without discussing. Letitia found herself looking forward to those evenings with an honesty she did not bother to deny to herself, even while she maintained a careful composure about it in public. They sat on the porch after supper more often than not, the three of them, watching the summer sky turn colors above the south pasture, talking about the things that mattered to people building lives in hard country. The markets, the land, the water table, a family that had lost their farm north of town to a bank that had foreclosed with what seemed like indecent haste, a dance that was being planned for late July at the church hall. One evening in mid-July, when Daniel had gone inside early, claiming tiredness that fooled neither of them, Letitia and Wallace sat on the porch steps in the dark, and she asked him something she had been thinking about. "Do you plan to stay?" she asked. "In Redemption Creek, long term." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark silhouette of the land. "I built a house," he said at last. "Finished the main addition last fall, put in a real kitchen and a second bedroom and a porch on 3 sides. When you build something like that, you are telling yourself an answer." She understood that. "I think I'm staying too," she said. It was the first time she had said it aloud, and saying it made it real. "I came to help Daniel, but I think this is where I want to be." He turned to look at her in the dark. His face was in shadow, but she could see the pale gleam of his eyes. "I am glad," he said quietly, with a directness that covered a great deal more than the words themselves. She did not respond to the undercurrent. Not yet. But she did not move away from it either. The dance at the church hall happened on a Saturday evening in late July, and it was exactly the kind of event that Redemption Creek did well. Genuinely joyful, slightly chaotic, full of children who had been allowed to stay up past their usual hour and were making the most of it, and music provided by 3 men with a fiddle, a guitar, and a harmonica who played with more enthusiasm than precision, but made up for it entirely in feeling. Wallace asked her to dance 3 times. She said yes each time. He was a good dancer, she discovered, not formally trained but naturally rhythmic, and with the quality she valued most in a partner, which was that he paid attention. He did not look around the room while they danced. He was present. By the third dance, which was slower, a waltz of sorts that the fiddle player attacked with great seriousness of purpose, she was aware that the distance between them had become rather small, and that this was entirely comfortable, and that this was information she needed to do something with. He walked her to the wagon afterward, through the warm July night with its enormous canopy of stars, and when they reached it he helped her up to the seat and then stood with his hand still lightly touching hers on the side of the wagon and said, "Letitia," just her name, but the way he said it. "Wallace," she said, equally simply. He looked at her in the dark, and the whole thing that had been building between them over weeks of tamales and porch conversations and account books and fence lines was right there in the space between them, visible and acknowledged. "I would like very much to come calling," he said. "Properly, with your knowledge and your agreement." She looked at him for a long moment. Her heart was doing something inconvenient, and she allowed it because it was honest. "I would like that," she said. He let go of her hand. He stepped back. He put his hat back on his head with a small, controlled movement that she suspected concealed a considerable amount of feeling. "Good evening, then," he said. "Good evening," she said, and drove home through the stars. August was courtship, and it was the best kind. The kind built on a foundation of genuine knowledge of the other person, where the novelty of formal attention simply gave permission to say what had already been felt. He came calling on Sundays, in addition to the regular suppers. They went for rides in the late afternoon when the heat had broken. He showed her the Bishop Ranch in full, walking her through the pastures and explaining what he had built and what he wanted to build, not as a man showing off his assets but as a person sharing something important. She understood the distinction. She showed him things too. The accounts she had reorganized, the system she had devised for tracking the box elders' supply needs, the garden that was producing more than they could use, and that she had begun sharing with 2 neighboring families. She was not a woman who performed smallness, and he was not a man who needed her to be. And this fundamental alignment felt, after her experience with Robert Hale, like cool water. Daniel watched all of this with the undisguised satisfaction of a man who felt the universe was finally demonstrating some competence, and was wise enough to say nothing about it directly beyond occasionally finding reasons to be elsewhere when they were on the porch. It was on one of the Sunday rides in the first week of September, with the heat beginning to ease and the grass turning gold, that Wallace Bishop, who was not a man who said things he had not thought through, said the thing. They had ridden up to the top of a low ridge that gave the best view in the county, east across the rolling land toward the distant thread of the creek, west toward the setting sun that was laying out colors across the sky that no painter had ever gotten quite right. They had stopped and sat quietly on their horses for a while, which was something they had gotten comfortable with, the silence between them having long since stopped being awkward and become instead a form of conversation. Then he said, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him. He was looking at the horizon, and his jaw was set in the way it got when he was saying something important. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "I have thought about it carefully, and I am certain. But I want to do it right, and I know you are not a woman who does things without good reason, so before I ask I want to know if there is anything I need to understand, anything that would matter to your answer." She was quiet for a moment. The sun moved a fraction. A red-tailed hawk called somewhere below them. She had been thinking about this too. She knew her own heart and she knew his, or she was beginning to. She was not afraid of the question. But there was one thing that had been in the back of her mind, not as a test, but as something that mattered genuinely. "There is one thing," she said. He looked at her then, full attention. "Daniel," she said, "his situation with the box elder, I will not leave him in a bad position. If I were to marry and move to the Bishop Ranch, the box elder would need more stability than it currently has. He is managing, but he is managing alone. He needs a reliable second hand, someone who knows the work and who will stay. Not just Eustace, who is good but who I think will move on when he has saved enough." She paused. "I will not say yes to anything until I know that Daniel is settled. Not financially given away or rescued. He would not want that and it would not be right. But settled. Someone he can rely on. A real hand who will commit to the box elder for more than a season." Wallace said nothing for a moment. He looked at the horizon again. Then he looked back at her, and there was no frustration in his expression, no impatience, just understanding. "That is fair," he said, "more than fair." "It is not a challenge," she said. "I am not testing you, it is simply what I need." "I know," he said. "I understand." He gathered his reins slightly. "Give me a little time." She nodded. They rode back in the golden evening, and she felt remarkably calm about the whole thing, which was itself a kind of answer. She did not expect what happened next. The following morning was a Monday, and she was in the kitchen garden pulling onions when she heard horses in the yard. She came around the side of the house and found Wallace, which was not itself surprising, except that there was a man with him she had not met before. He was perhaps 50, lean and weathered, with a face that had a particular kind of competence in it, the face of someone who had spent a lifetime doing hard work well and knew it. Daniel had come out onto the porch. He looked as puzzled as she felt. "Daniel," Wallace said, "this is Herb McCready. He and I worked together in Kansas when I was young. He has been foreman on a spread up in the Panhandle for the past 6 years, but the ranch was sold last month, and he has been looking for a new situation. He knows cattle as well as any man I have met." Herb McCready nodded to Daniel with a directness that was its own kind of communication. "I hear you have a good spread here that just needs steadying," he said. "I am not interested in a temporary arrangement. I am 52 years old and I am looking for a place to settle and work properly. Mr. Bishop says you are a fair man." Daniel looked at Wallace. Then he looked at Herb McCready. Then, slowly, he looked at Letitia. She felt something move through her chest like a warm current. Wallace was not looking at her. He was looking at Daniel, because this was Daniel's decision and he understood that. He had not arranged this to perform generosity or to win a prize. He had heard what mattered to her, genuinely heard it, and he had thought about what could actually help, and then he had done it. That same afternoon he had sent a telegram to Herb Macready, and the man had been on a horse by the next morning. "Let us talk," Daniel said to Herb Macready, with a gesture toward the porch. The two men went up, and there was immediately something in the quality of the conversation between them, two experienced ranchmen discussing the particulars of land and cattle and work, that had the ring of something that was going to work out. Wallace had come to stand near her at the edge of the yard. He was not looking at her directly. "You sent for him last night," she said. "After I got home," he said. "He was already on his way by this morning." She looked at the side of his face. He was watching the porch, giving her nothing, just standing there with his hat in his hands in a quiet that was as loud as anything she had ever heard. "Wallace." He looked at her. "Yes," she said. He was very still. Then the full smile came, slow and enormous, and she felt it somewhere deep in her center. "You have not heard the question yet," he said. "I know the question," she said. He put his hat back on. He took a breath. He said, "Letitia Covington, will you do me the honor of being my wife?" "Yes," she said again, and her voice was entirely steady and completely warm, and that was exactly right. He took her hand. His grip was careful and certain. They stood in the yard of the box elder, while on the porch her brother and Herb Macready talked about fencing and cattle numbers and the water access along the South Creek. And the September sun laid itself across the land in all its golden abundance. And Letitia Covington understood that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The weeks between the engagement and the wedding were full and fine. The engagement had been an open secret in Redemption Creek for long enough that the announcement was met more with satisfied confirmation than with genuine surprise, but that did not diminish the warmth of it. Mrs. Peel at the general store was so pleased that she gave Letitia a discount on 3 yards of good calico without explaining why. Senora Flores, when Letitia stopped at the market the following Tuesday, pressed both her hands and spoke of it with a genuine happiness that moved Letitia considerably. Herb Macready had taken the position at the box elder after a single long conversation with Daniel that had ended with a handshake and a supper. He was already proving his worth in the way that quiet, capable people do, not with fanfare but with a steady transformation of the daily texture of the work. Eustace, who had seemed to be working himself up to giving notice, instead found himself unexpectedly learning from someone who knew vastly more than he did, and appeared to relax into the situation with considerable relief. Daniel's exhaustion began to ease. He started sleeping properly again. Letitia and Wallace planned the wedding for November, after the main cattle season. There was a great deal to arrange, not because they wanted a large affair, but because on the frontier, events like weddings were community events, occasions for people scattered across great distances to gather and remember they were connected to each other. The pastor at Redemption Creek's church, a kind man named Pastor Hendricks, who had been on the frontier long enough to understand that the forms of civilization in harsh country served an emotional purpose beyond the merely formal, was enthusiastic and practical, and helped them plan something that was simple enough to do well. She moved into the Bishop Ranch 3 weeks before the wedding to begin setting up the household properly. This required some creative interpretation of the conventions of the time and place, but the frontier was always more pragmatic than the cities about such things, and the Bishop Ranch's 2 permanent hands, an older man named Cecil and a younger one named Tomas, both treated the whole business with the comfortable indifference of men who cared only that there would be better food and a properly kept house, and that Wallace would stop being so quietly lonely that it was sometimes painful to observe. The house was better than she had expected. Wallace had been telling the truth about the additions. The kitchen was genuinely good, with a proper stove and a larder and a window that faced east and let in the morning light. The main bedroom had wood floors and 2 real windows. The porch on 3 sides was her favorite thing. She could stand on the north porch in the early morning with her coffee and see for what felt like forever, and she did this every single morning from the first week and never got tired of it. She began making it hers, which meant making it theirs, which was something she had not let herself think about before it was real, and which she now thought about with a plain-spoken happiness that she did not try to diminish or sophisticate away. Wallace watched her settle into his house with an expression that he did not always manage to keep off his face, which was fine because she was not trying very hard to hide hers either. One evening 2 weeks before the wedding, she was at the kitchen table with the ranch account spread before her, working through the numbers with the focused pleasure she took in bringing order to complexity. The lamp threw warm light across the table. The night outside was cool, the first real cold of autumn having arrived that week, and the smell of it came through the slightly open window along with the distant sound of cattle settling for the night. Wallace came in from checking on the horses, hung his coat on the peg by the door and sat across from her at the table. He watched her work for a while without speaking. She was aware of his attention in the particular way she had come to know, a warmth on the side of her face. "Your books are better organized than mine," he said at last. "Yes," she agreed without looking up. "I have made some notes. We should talk about the supply arrangements in town. You are paying too much at Whitfield's and there is a better price available if you consolidate your orders." "I have been meaning to address that," he said. "I know I will address it." He was quiet for a moment. "Letitia," she looked up. His expression was the open one, the one he did not use in public. "I want you to know," he said, "that you do not have to manage everything. I know that is what you have always done, but you have me now. You can put some of it down." She looked at him for a long time. It was a thing that should have been simple to hear and was not, because she had spent so long being entirely self-reliant that the invitation to be otherwise felt unfamiliar in her hands, like a tool she had not used before. "I know," she said finally. "Do you?" "I am learning," she said, and the honesty of it surprised her a little and clearly moved him. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, on top of the account book. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that for a while in the lamplight, with the account still open and the cool night air coming through the window and the cattle quiet in the dark pasture. And she thought that this was what she had been looking for without fully knowing she was looking. Not rescue or protection, or even the grand, passionate sweep of the novels she had read as a girl, but this, a person who saw her fully and stayed. The wedding was on a Saturday in the first week of November, 1878, and it was everything that a frontier wedding should be, which is to say it was practical and warm and slightly chaotic and deeply real. Pastor Hendricks conducted the ceremony in the church hall, which Senora Flores and 3 other women from the community had decorated with late autumn wildflowers and dried grasses, and some ribbon that Mrs. Peel had donated with the kind of magnificent generosity that is also always slightly proprietary. There were perhaps 80 people crowded into a space designed for 60, which on the frontier is simply called a good turnout. Daniel stood with Wallace, having been asked to stand up with him in the place of friends and family who were too far away, and Letitia had asked a woman named Ruth Alcott, who taught at the Redemption Creek school that had been established the previous year, and whom she had befriended over the summer, to stand with her. She wore a dress that she had made herself from the calico that Mrs. Peel had discounted, deep blue, which was a color she knew suited her, with white trim at the collar and cuffs. She wore her mother's pearl earrings. She carried a small bundle of dried lavender from the garden, because there were no fresh flowers left in November, and she preferred honest simplicity to pretense in any case. Wallace wore his best clothes, which were clean and pressed and which fit him well, and when she walked into the hall on Daniel's arm and saw him standing at the front with his hands clasped in front of him, and that particular composure on his face that she had learned, covered a deep capacity for feeling. Something in her chest, did something that she could not put any more precise a name to than rightness. Pastor Hendricks kept the ceremony to its essentials and said them with genuine feeling, which was what mattered. When he asked if she would take Wallace Bishop to be her husband, she said yes in a voice that was clear and certain and reached every corner of the room. When he asked if Wallace would take Letitia Covington to be his wife, Wallace said, "I will," in a voice that was quiet and absolute. When Pastor Hendricks told him he could kiss the bride, Wallace looked at her first, a brief, private look that asked the question properly, and she answered it by the slight tilt of her chin, and he kissed her with a gentleness that was also entirely serious. And someone in the back of the room let out a whoop that started a general outbreak of celebration. The supper afterward was magnificent, as community suppers in small frontier towns always were when everyone brought their best. There were 3 fiddlers this time, and they played until the lamps were low, and the children were asleep in corners, and the adults were pleasantly tired and satisfied. Letitia danced 3 times with her husband, which was already the word she was testing in her mind with a quiet pleasure, and once with Daniel, who held her hands and looked at her with bright eyes and did not try to say anything, which was exactly the right choice. She and Wallace drove home through the dark November night, wrapped in blankets against the cold, under a sky that was startlingly clear and packed with stars from horizon to horizon. He had one arm around her against the chill, and she was leaning slightly into his warmth, and neither of them needed to say anything about any of it. When they pulled into the Bishop Ranch yard and he helped her down from the wagon, and they stood for a moment in the cold, starlit dark before the house that was now theirs together, he looked at her in the way she had come to know meant he was about to say something that mattered. "Are you glad?" he asked. She looked up at him. His face in the starlight was the face of a man who was asking in all seriousness, and who would receive any answer she gave with the same steadiness he brought to everything. "I am very glad," she said. He put both hands on her face and kissed her again, properly this time, and the cold November night was entirely outside them. Winter on the frontier is not the gentle season it is sometimes made to be in stories. It comes with a hard competence that demands to be respected. The first real norther of that year hit in December, dropping temperatures overnight to something that froze the water in the barrel by the barn door and kept the cattle huddled in the low ground for 3 days. There was work in it, the breaking of ice on the stock tanks morning and evening, the hauling of extra feed, the wind that came in off the flat land to the north with nothing to slow it for 100 miles. But there was also the interior of a well-built house with a good stove and a woman who knew how to make the space around her feel inhabited in the best sense of that word. Letitia had transformed the Bishop Ranch house in ways that were practical and also in ways that were harder to name. The bunch of dried herbs hanging in the kitchen, the curtains she had sewn for the bedroom windows, the way the lamps were placed, so the light in the evenings was warm rather than just functional. Cecil and Tomas, who ate their supper at the main house, both became noticeably more cheerful within 2 weeks of the wedding, which Cecil attributed to the cooking, which was genuinely excellent, and Tomas attributed to the general atmosphere, which was also genuinely better. Wallace and Letitia settled into each other the way 2 people do when they are fundamentally compatible and have enough room for it. They argued sometimes, because both of them had opinions and neither was inclined to suppress them. But the arguments were the productive kind, honest exchanges between equals that generally ended with a better understanding than either had started with. There was a disagreement in January about whether to accept a credit arrangement offered by a new merchant in town, in which Letitia was right, a fact Wallace acknowledged with a directness that she appreciated. There was a disagreement in February about the best approach to a difficult horse that Wallace was training, in which he was right, which she acknowledged with equal directness, and which made him smile. They talked every evening. This was the thing she had not fully anticipated, and that she found she valued most, the nightly conversation on the porch or by the fire when the weather was too cold for the porch, about everything and nothing, about what had happened in the day and what they were thinking about and what they wanted, the deep, ordinary intimacy of two people who had decided to see each other fully. She wrote to Daniel twice a week. He wrote back with increasing cheerfulness. Herb Macready had proven himself exactly the man he appeared to be, steady and skilled, and entirely committed to the box elder. The cattle numbers were looking good for the spring. Daniel had, in February, mentioned a woman in his letters for the first time, a widow named Ellen Marsh who had a small farm north of town, with a casualness that fooled no one. Letitia wrote back with a careful, warm encouragement that was one of the best letters she had ever composed, and that Daniel never directly acknowledged, but that was followed, a month later, by a mention of having had supper at Ellen Marsh's farm, which was all the response she needed. The spring came with a rush of green that always surprised her no matter how many times she experienced it, the land going from gold and brown to a vivid new color, seemingly overnight after the first warm rains. The kitchen garden went in again, larger this time, and she persuaded Tomas, who had a genuine aptitude for growing things that he had never had occasion to develop, to take charge of a portion of it, which he did with an enthusiasm that Cecil found deeply suspicious, and which produced very good results. By April, Letitia knew she was pregnant. She told Wallace on a Sunday morning when they were sitting on the north porch with their coffee, watching the new light come across the pasture. She had known for about 2 weeks, wanting to be certain before she spoke, and the certainty had been sitting in her with a quiet wonder that she had not tried to rush past or rationalize into something smaller. She turned to him and said, "I believe we are going to need the second bedroom." He looked at her with the instant understanding of a person who has been paying attention, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen on him before, something younger and more open than his usual composure, something that was close to overwhelmed. "Letitia," he said. "I think February," she said. "I will need to speak with Mrs. Alcott about finding a midwife." He set down his coffee cup. He reached over and took both her hands. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking, which was fine because his face was saying everything. "Are you well?" he asked at last, which was exactly the right first question. "I am very well," she said. "I feel entirely myself, a little tired in the mornings." "I will handle the morning stock check," he said immediately. "You do not need to do that every morning." "I would like to," he said. She looked at him. "Do not begin making me smaller," she said, gently but clearly. He absorbed this. "I hear you," he said, "but let me do the morning stock check." She considered. "That is acceptable," she said. He brought her hands to his mouth and kissed them, and she felt the warmth of it all the way up her arms. They told Daniel at the next Sunday supper, which now happened at the Bishop Ranch alternating with the box elder, and Daniel's response was to stand up from the table so quickly he nearly knocked over his coffee, and then stand there looking at his sister with an expression so openly joyful that she had to press her lips together to keep from crying, which she was generally opposed to doing at supper. He came around the table and hugged her properly, the way he used to when they were children and something wonderful had happened, and then straightened up and shook Wallace's hand with both of his and said, "You had better build an addition." "I am already planning it," Wallace said. "A porch off the south side," Letitia said, "for the afternoon light." Both men looked at her. "I have been thinking about it for a while," she said. The summer of 1879 was the fullest she had ever lived. Her days were rich and various. The management of the ranch, the correspondence with suppliers and market contacts that she had systematized to a point where it was efficient without being impersonal, the garden that Tomas was now running like a small agricultural enterprise, and producing abundantly, the ongoing project of the ranch house which Wallace and Cecil were extending with a south-facing addition that would eventually be a proper sitting room, and the south porch she wanted. She rode until August, when the pregnancy made it genuinely impractical, and then she made her peace with walking the near pastures and the kitchen garden and the yard, which was plenty of territory, and which she inhabited with a physical contentment that she had not fully expected. Her body was doing something extraordinary, and she found she respected it for it. Wallace was present in the way she had needed from him, and had never had to ask for directly, which was its own form of grace. He was not hovering. He was not treating her as fragile. He was simply there, attentive in the steady way that was his fundamental nature, adapted now to new circumstances. He finished reading to her on the porch every evening through the summer and into the fall, working their way through a novel that a traveling bookseller had brought through town in June, pausing regularly to argue about whether the protagonist was making good or terrible decisions, which Letitia maintained were the same question depending on your values, and which Wallace found an amusing position. They argued and laughed and worked and planned and loved each other through the long, bright summer and the cooling fall, and it was good, genuinely good, the kind of good that has texture and weight to it, and that you know you will remember. The Boxelder cattle drive that fall was a success. Daniel came home from Abilene with better numbers than he had seen in 3 years, enough to clear the remaining debt and leave something over for improvements. He arrived at the Bishop Ranch the day after his return, wind-burned and tired, but with a light in his face that had not been there for a long time, and he sat at Letitia's kitchen table and ate the first proper meal he had had in weeks, and told them all about it with a talker's energy that had apparently been building up on the trail for 2 months. He also, in the course of this visit, mentioned that he had asked Ellen Marsh to marry him. Letitia looked at her brother across the kitchen table, this man she had known all her life, and felt a happiness for him that was almost overwhelming in its size. And she said yes, she asked. She said she needed to think about it, Daniel said with a rueful expression. Good for her, Letitia said. She said yes the following morning, Daniel added. Letitia laughed, and it was the full, bright laugh that Wallace had told her once was the most valuable sound in his life, and she did not try to reduce it. December came, and with it the serious waiting. The midwife that Ruth Alcott had helped her find, a capable and experienced woman named Mrs. Dyer, who had attended more births than she could count on the frontier, came to check on her twice in the last month, and was reassuring in the practical way that Letitia trusted more than false comfort. Wallace was very calm in the particular way that suggested he was working hard at it, which she loved him for. He finished the South Edition in a rush of activity in the first week of December, with help from Daniel and Herb Macready and Tomas, and the South Porch was exactly as she had imagined it, facing the afternoon sun, with a view of the low hill to the south where the hawks nested in the spring. The baby came on a Sunday morning in the second week of February, 1880, in the way of births that are long and serious, and then suddenly accomplished. Mrs. Dyer was there. Wallace was in the house, sent to the kitchen by Mrs. Dyer with a firmness that permitted no argument, where he was reported by Tomas, who had no business being anywhere near the situation but who had somehow ended up there anyway, to have made and discarded 4 pots of coffee and split an unnecessary amount of firewood. It was a boy. He was healthy and large and extremely indignant about the entire situation, which he expressed at volume from the first moment. When Mrs. Dyer brought Wallace in, he stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a moment, looking at Letitia propped against the pillows with her hair loose around her shoulders and the small, furious person in her arms, and whatever he had been working to keep composed came undone in a way she had never seen before, and that she knew she would keep with her for the rest of her life. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with the expression of a man seeing the thing he had not known he was building toward. His name, she said. You choose, he said, without looking away from the baby. She had thought about this. James, she said. James Wallace Bishop. He looked at her then. Your father's name, he said. Yes, she said. He put his arm around her shoulders very carefully, and she leaned into him, and James Wallace Bishop continued his commentary on the injustices of the world at the top of his voice, and neither of his parents tried to quiet him. The spring that followed was the spring she had always imagined without knowing she was imagining it. James was a robust and demanding baby who had opinions from the very beginning, and who grew with an enthusiasm that made Mrs. Dyer, on her follow-up visits, nod approvingly and say he was thriving. The house was full of the particular kind of noise and warmth and slight chaos that a new baby brings, and both Letitia and Wallace adapted to it with different strengths that turned out to complement each other. She was systematic about the feeding and sleeping schedule, which she established with a firmness that the baby tested regularly and eventually accepted. Wallace was the one who could be found in the small hours walking the main room with a quiet, patient repetition that calmed James in a way nothing else did. Cecil pretended to be indifferent to the whole business and was caught 3 times talking to the baby through the kitchen window. Daniel and Ellen married in March, a quiet ceremony at the Box Elder, and Letitia stood with her brother at the front of the small group of friends and family, and watched him marry a woman who was steady and warm and who looked at Daniel with a clear-eyed affection that was everything she had hoped for him. Ellen, who had 2 children of her own from her first marriage, a boy of 8 named Sam and a girl of 6 named Beatty, took to the Box Elder with a practical energy that transformed it in ways that were immediate and obvious. And Daniel took to those children with a gentleness that was, as Letitia told Wallace privately, almost unfairly touching. The Box Elder was becoming the place it had always had the potential to be. Herb Macready was a fixed point around which the ranch's operations had organized themselves into something stable and productive. The numbers that spring were the best in years. The summer of 1880 was hot and dry, but the Bishop Ranch weathered it well, with the water management systems that Wallace had put in over the previous 2 years providing enough for the stock through the worst weeks. The cattle were selling at decent prices. The south porch came into its own in the long, light evenings, exactly as Letitia had known it would. She sat out there with James in the late afternoon, watching him discover first grass and then motion, and then the entirely captivating subject of birds, which seemed to absorb him completely, and she thought frequently about her mother and what she would have made of this life, and believed she would have approved. She was also, by September, fairly certain she was pregnant again. She told Wallace on the south porch in the early evening, with James already asleep in his crib and the cicadas going in the scrub and the last light on the hill. He looked at her with the expression she now knew went with this kind of news from her, the open, younger face, the thing close to overwhelmed. "February again?" he asked. "Probably March," she said. "A spring baby," he said. "Yes." He put his hand on her face in the way he did, gently and with the full weight of his attention. "You are extraordinary," he said. "I am entirely ordinary," she said. "I am simply living my life." "That is what I mean," he said. She covered his hand with hers. The hill to the south had gone dark against the last of the light. The first stars were coming. "Are you happy, Wallace?" She asked, not because she did not know, but because she liked to hear him say it. "There is not a word for what I am," he said. "Happy is too small." She leaned into him. He put his arm around her, and they sat in the warm September dark while the stars came out, one and then many, and the land around them settled into the quiet that had always been its true voice. The second child was born in March of 1881, as predicted, a girl this time, and she came into the world with considerably more ease than her brother had and lay in her mother's arms with a watchful, curious expression that seemed to be attempting to take full inventory of her surroundings from the first hours. They named her Catherine, for Wallace's mother. Letitia had suggested it and had watched his face when she did, and his expression had confirmed it was exactly right. James, now 13 months old and in full command of his mobility and opinions, accepted his sister with a philosophical tolerance that occasionally shaded into very genuine interest, particularly after she was old enough to do things, which happened sooner than anyone quite expected. Catherine Bishop was a child who did everything early and thoroughly, and who kept every adult in her vicinity fully employed, which was a family trait that her mother observed with a fondness that was also entirely aware. Ruth Alcott, who had become Letitia's closest friend in Redemption Creek, visited regularly and was beloved by both children in the way that people who are honest with children always are. She was also, by the fall of 1881, being courted by a quiet man named Henry Cole, who ran the newspaper that had been established in Redemption Creek the previous year, and who was, in Letitia's assessment, exactly suited to Ruth in ways that Ruth was still in the process of recognizing. Letitia offered her opinion on the matter once, with precision, and then left it alone, because that was how it should be done. She was right. By spring of 1882, Ruth and Henry were engaged, and by summer they were married, and by the following year there was a baby. And Letitia sat with Ruth through that labor the way Ruth had sat with her through the first of hers, and the circle of it felt right. By 1882, the railroad had finally come within real distance of Redemption Creek, not quite through the town itself, but close enough that the markets were changing, and the cattle drives to Abilene were already being replaced by more local shipping arrangements that were more efficient, and that changed the economics of ranching in ways that required careful attention and flexible thinking. Wallace navigated the change with the combination of practicality and openness to new information that had always characterized his approach to the ranch, and Letitia's facility with accounts and markets was worth more than ever in the shifting landscape. They expanded the Bishop Ranch that year, buying a quarter section to the north that gave them better water access and added quality grazing land. The purchase was the result of 6 months of careful planning and one specific set of negotiations with a bank in the county seat that Letitia conducted herself, driving over on a morning in April with her accounts prepared and her arguments organized, and returning that afternoon with terms that were better than Wallace had thought achievable. He had looked at the papers she brought back and then looked at her and said, simply, "I am genuinely in awe of you," and she had taken that home like something valuable. The town of Redemption Creek grew through the early 1880s in the way that frontier towns did when conditions were favorable, not dramatically but steadily, adding a proper hotel and a second school and a doctor's office and a hardware store, and some of the accumulating infrastructure of civilization that meant the worst of the frontier's isolation was beginning to ease. This was not an unmixed thing. The same growth that brought a doctor also brought more of the Eastern assumption that the land could be endlessly divided and sold, which pressed on the Tejano families who had been there for generations, and whose land claims were still inadequately protected by a legal system that had been designed by and for other people. Letitia was explicit about these injustices in her conversations with the people who could do something about them, which at the local level was not nothing, and she continued to have her regular conversations with Senora Flores at the market with a respect that went in both directions. James Bishop, as he grew from baby to toddler to proper small boy with a personality that was increasingly his own, showed a vivid interest in everything, particularly horses and the outdoors and any tool that could be taken apart, and his father moved through the days of his childhood with the particular quality of a man who could not quite believe his own fortune. Letitia watched them together with a fullness in her chest that she had stopped trying to contain or rationalize, and simply accepted as the appropriate response to being given what you had hoped for and more. Catherine was a different creature from her brother, quieter in her surface and more intense underneath, with an aptitude for language that showed up early and that Letitia, the former schoolteacher, recognized with a particular joy. By the time Catherine was 3, she was asking questions about words that required actual thought to answer well, and Letitia answered every one with the seriousness it deserved. Wallace watched his wife teach their children with an expression he wore openly now, without the careful composure that had been necessary before he had a home and people in it. the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not know he was going, and found it better than anything he had imagined. There was an evening in the fall of 1882, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, and the south porch held the last warmth of the October sun, when Letitia and Wallace sat in their usual chairs with their coffee, and the familiar comfortable silence settled around them. And she thought about the morning she had stepped down from the stagecoach into the Redemption Creek dust, with her 2 trunks and her practical composure and her privately guarded heart. And what she could have told herself then about what was waiting 4 years ahead, she thought she might not have believed it. Not because the happiness was improbable, but because it was so fully itself, so entire, so much a thing that had been built from real materials by real people making real choices, that it had a weight and a substance to it that was different from the happiness of stories. It was not simple. It had cost things. It had required the particular bravery of choosing to let someone see you clearly. It had required patience and honesty and the willingness to say, "Here is what I need," and to mean it, and to find that the person you were saying it to heard you completely. She thought about the condition she had named, standing on that September ridge with the hawk calling below and the sun going down. She thought about what it had meant that he had not asked to be given time to think about it or arrange something symbolically satisfying but ultimately hollow. He had heard what mattered, genuinely heard it, and he had gone home and sent a telegram, and the following afternoon Herb Macready had been riding toward the box elder. Not because he was trying to win something, but because he was the kind of man who, when something mattered, did the thing about it. That day. That same afternoon. She had said yes twice that day, and she had been right both times. "Wallace," she said. He looked over at her in the late afternoon light, unhurried. "I want you to know," she said, "that I know what I have. I know it exactly." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with the open face, the one that was entirely his and entirely for her. "So do I," he said. She reached over and took his hand, and he held it with the care and certainty that had never changed in 4 years, and that she knew now would not change. Not because nothing ever changed, but because some things were built deeply enough to last, and they were one of those things. The sun moved down toward the south hill. Somewhere in the house, James was talking to himself in the particular running commentary he maintained while playing, and the sound of it came through the open window like something precious. Catherine was asleep, her dark hair spread on the pillow, her small face composed in the perfect peace of early childhood. Cecil was somewhere in the barn making improbable amounts of noise with equipment that never seemed to require quite so much clanging as he always found for it. Tomas was in the garden with his careful hands, bringing in the last of the fall harvest with the satisfaction of a man who had found his calling in the soil. Herb Macready was over at the box elder, doing what he always did. The steady, competent, irreplaceable work of a man who had found his place and stayed in it. Redemption Creek was settling into the evening the way it always did, with its 400 souls and its 2 saloons and its growing newspaper and its school and its church whose paint had finally been refreshed, and its market where Senora Flores still made the best tamales in the territory, and where the world was more complicated and more unjust than it should be and more full of goodness than it sometimes appeared. The stars would come later. The south porch would hold them until it was too cold, and then they would go inside to the warm house, and the fire and the sleeping children, and all the particular beauty of an ordinary evening that was, for the people living it, anything but ordinary. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, living a life she had built with her own hands and her own clear head and her whole heart, beside a man who had heard her the first time and acted on it the same afternoon, and who had been hearing her fully and continuously ever since. And it was good. It was completely, solidly, lastingly good. The kind that has roots.